Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene per year. Ron Yukalik is out this week, much to all of our dismay, of course, so you'll just have to make do with me alone here. But the good news is as always, we've got a great show for you here. We're going to be touching on, everything all around the world, things that you wouldn't even know about. The British elections, obviously the liberation recently of Julian Assange, the impact of the Gaza war and the U.S. military, a pretty unbelievable story in relationship to how mass incarceration and the Dobbs decision stripping women of their right to choose as it concerns abortion are sort of coinciding with one another. And we will also be talking, so stay tuned all the way to the end of the show, about the still ongoing uprising, you could call it, I think, in Kenya, where massive protests there have erupted over the various aspects of a budget bill and other things of that nature. So we've got a ton here for you on the show, as we always do. And a reminder to everyone who is watching on YouTube, very happy to have you here. But good chance to let you know you should, if you're not already, subscribe to our YouTube page, Breakthrough News, where you are. So just under the screen, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Do it now. Do it right away before it's too late. I guess it will never be too late, but you should just do it now so you don't forget. And on top of that, make sure you hit the bell, which makes sure you get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to. So that way, you won't have to go very far to find all the fantastic content we're putting out here on Breakthrough News, including dispatches with Ron Yukalik, some excellent episodes that have been released. But this way, you'll be on top of everything that we are doing. So go ahead, if you're on YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you can get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to. Also, as always, want to give a big shout out to all of you who are watching on Free Speech TV. You don't really have to do anything. Just continue to keep watching. Very happy to have you here. Very happy to be in your homes. And a big shout out to the Free Speech TV team for making it possible for us to appear to you in this medium. And of course, as we always like to remind people as well, if you do want to become a sustaining donor for Breakthrough News, you can do that by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Certainly, this is, one of the most critical forms of support we can have, is to have your ongoing month-to-month support for what we do here. And a big shout out to all of our existing patrons. Of course, no amount is too small, no amount is too large. Maybe the latter one is the most important one there. But, I think with the number of people we have following us now and watching us now, if everyone was giving that $5, $10 a month, whatever it is, $15,000, $5,000 a month, whatever feels right to you, we can do a lot when we come together. So don't think that your contribution, even if you feel it's modest, it is not modest. It is, in fact, very important, because it is coming together with, many, many other people around the United States and, of course, actually around the world who are contributing to Breakthrough News. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can get great things like this mug here. We have a fantastic mug for you. Great mug. You can get that. And also, of course, access to some of our exclusive content, like some elements of Dispatches with Ron Yukalik, some of which is free, some of which is very special, and you must be a patron to access. I also do a monthly seminar on Africa issues. You get access to that if you're a patron, and many, many more things. So there's a lot there for you, but most importantly, you get to keep Breakthrough News moving forward and bringing you all the content that you appreciate so much, because that's why you're here, and we would prefer to be accountable to you and no one else. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Also, just before we get started here, I'll just say, however you can let people know that we're here, we're getting ready to start. We have a great show, whether it's be an air horn, a text, a knock on the door of your neighbor, yelling to your roommate in the other room, whatever you got to do, make sure you do it, because we want whoever is following you to be following us here on the Freedom Side as we delve into another week of critically important stories. So subscribe, hit the bell, patreon.com/Breakthrough News, and let people know that we are here and we are moving. So we want to turn to our first story here, and our first story is the elections coming up in the United Kingdom next week on July 4th, Independence Day for the United States from the United Kingdom. I don't know there's any irony or anything to be said about that, but just seems notable to some degree. But nonetheless, significant elections here in the United Kingdom. As always, a lot to discuss as in terms of how the elections are playing out and the issues that are the most important. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Ben Shako, who is a journalist and the editor of the Morning Star newspaper there in the UK. Ben, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, really an honor to have you here. I feel there's a lot that can be said with the election, but I wanted to maybe start with something that was in the editorial in the Morning Star today, and that is in the outcome of this election, it could be the lowest combined percentage for the two major parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, in some years. So looking at that, what does that say about this election and about where the British political system is at this moment?
Well, I think it says that there's a gulf, an enormous gulf between what the politicians of the main parties are saying in Britain and what ordinary people think and want. If we look across the channel at France, you've got a polarizing election there where actual choices are facing the French people with, far-right nationalism in terms of Le Pen's Rassemblement National on one side, and what is quite an encouraging a unity of left forces and the Popular Front on the left, and it's the centre that's being squeezed out of that contest. But in Britain, we don't have that at all. The difference between the two main parties is smaller than I can remember. Obviously the period of the last two general elections in Britain, the Labour Party was led by Jeremy Corbyn. It was much more socialist, much more left-wing than it has historically ordinarily been. But Keir Starmer's Labour Party is not even, in 2015 when Ed Miliband was up against David Cameron, there were clear policy differences between the two. That's not really the case here. So that's playing out in terms of the polling, and Labour is polling not very well. 36% was the latest YouGov poll. Obviously, they fluctuate a little bit, but it's noteworthy that is considerably less than Labour got in 2017 when it lost the election under Jeremy Corbyn. But that is still likely to give Labour an enormous landslide majority in Parliament, because the Conservative Party are polling at just 18%, half the Labour vote. And that's a completely unprecedented collapse for the Tory party. I think that it's potentially of historic significance if the Conservative Party, which styles itself not without some justification the most successful capitalist party in the world. This is a party which has dominated British politics for over 200 years. If it falls down to this really, really low level of support, and at the moment it's polling just 1% ahead of Reform, the right-wing nationalist outfit of Nigel Farage was on 17% in that very same poll, then the traditional vehicle, the sort of A-team of British capitalism, looks like it might be out of the picture for a long time. Some people on the left say optimistically permanently. But I think we need to look at what the deeper social causes of this are. I would see that as a mass withdrawal of consent from the establishment. In that sense, it has some similar causes to the Brexit vote of 2016 and to the Corbyn surge of 2015 to 17, 18, in that, the ruling establishment in Britain is not able to get consent for its preferred model of governance. And what we're seeing at the moment is a collapse in Conservative support because of that. But we shouldn't be encouraged by that as socialists, particularly because that figure of the Reform Party on 17% shows that the majority of that Tory vote is going to the right. It's not going to the left. And if you added that to the Tory and Reform UK votes together in that poll, then they're only 1% behind the Labour Party. It's actually a much closer contest between right and left than we might imagine. If that plays out in a general election, as I say, Labour will win an enormous majority because of the British electoral system. In a first-past-the-post system like this, the sheer unpopularity of the Conservatives will lead to a massive landslide for Keir Starmer, but his huge power that he'll derive from such a majority will be based on a lower level of popular support than any prime minister has ever enjoyed since the universal franchise.
Mm.
And I mean, I look at France and I wonder whether this is what we'll be seeing in Britain in 5 years. Macron was the last gasp of the sort of neoliberal centre. There was a lot of triumphalism when he won in 2017 by liberals who said the polarizing politics of Europe had been seen off by this fresh face for the liberal centre. But even then, that was exaggerated. Actually, he got about 25% of the vote in the first poll there. And Macron benefited from the fact that the anti-system vote in France was split between the far right and the socialist left. Now, Macron's inability to resolve any of those longer-term systemic problems that are afflicting the whole of the West, but I think particularly Western Europe, in terms of declining living standards, collapsing public services because of 40 years in which neoliberal policy has prioritized profit over everything else, has sold off much of the public sector, and wages as a share of gross national product right across the EU, but also in Britain, have steadily declined. Now, you can't resolve those problems with Keir Starmer's policies, so I think he will find, like Macron, that in 5 years' time the people are just as angry with his government as they are at the moment with the Tory government, and that's where the real challenge lies. Because at the moment the left is nowhere in this election. If this happens and the left hasn't got its act together in a few years to be able to intervene coherently, and when I say nowhere, there are left challenges in certain areas, most famously Jeremy Corbyn himself, who's been expelled from the Labour Party, standing in Islington North. He's got a good chance of winning, though it's not guaranteed. And there's some others in other parts of the country who may do well, but there's no coherent national challenge from the left. And what we're seeing in France, I think, is something that the British left need to start taking very seriously, because currently we would be slaughtered by Reform UK in any head-to-head contest, and that's what we might be seeing a few years down the line.
Well, and let me also ask you this, because obviously, England, the UK more broadly has been the site of a huge Palestine solidarity movement, which I know is playing a big role in this election and to some degree sort of fracturing some of the left beliefs about how to vote, who to vote for, independent candidates coming forward, different things like that. But maybe just in a general sense, how is the genocide in Gaza and the movement that has erupted inside of the UK impacting the election coming up next week?
I think it's hard to say at a national level, because, of course, there isn't an anti-imperialist option in terms of who to elect for the government. And there's a split within the Labour Party. There was a big rebellion by Labour MPs against Keir Starmer in November, where around 90 MPs broke the Labour whip to vote for an immediate ceasefire. So those MPs, their support is maybe holding up better, but I think we see it in that distinct lack of enthusiasm for Labour nationally. Those polling figures we discussed reflects the enormous anger of millions of people over what's happening in Palestine. There's been an exodus from Labour in terms of councillors. Many of those standing against Labour were members of the Labour Party very recently, not just Jeremy Corbyn, but people like Faiza Shaheen, who was, until about a month ago, everybody assumed would be the Labour candidate for the seat in which she's standing, Chingford and Wood Green, but was kicked out basically because of her public support for Palestine at the last minute in a stitch up in the selection process. So we have those kind of candidates. We have candidates like George Galloway of the Workers' Party, who have made Palestine is sort of key campaigning issue. So we'll see probably one or two upsets in different parts of the country as a direct result of the Palestine vote. But because, as I say, there's no unity on the left at the moment. There are different challenges in different areas. I would wish many of them very, very well. I hope that Labour gets a bit of a bloody nose over this issue. But I don't see it being a big enough revolt to change the outcome, because a lot of people will simply stop voting. They'll say there isn't a candidate who can win here who's pro-Palestine, so they won't vote at all. And of course, the sitting government, the Tories, are all pro-Israel, and the Labour Party. So there isn't in terms of the kind of two-party default of the British system, I don't think it will affect Labour's vote enough to change the overall picture on July the 5th. But what we do have to bear in mind is that the government has already been moved by the Palestine movement on the streets. The Labour Party has already been moved by that movement on the streets. Britain would not have voted for a ceasefire at the UN Security Council if it was not for the mass movement on the streets. And the Labour Party would not have come round to a ceasefire position earlier this year if it were not for that movement. So I would say we have to keep protesting. We have to put whatever pressure, whoever's elected on July the 5th, to force a ceasefire. I mean, the situation in Israel, I'm not here to talk about Israel, but that is a government which seems increasingly dysfunctional, even within its own terms, in terms of the collapse of the war cabinet and the stuff that Tamar Ben-Gvir is saying in terms of telling police not to interfere with mobs attacking aid convoys and things like that. It needs expressing, but the real danger, and I know I have a tendency to sort of talk too much, perhaps. I'm not letting you get
No, please continue.
The real danger is that the default reaction of the British government to these protests so far has been, can we forcibly shut them down? There was an attempt to ban the march on Armistice Day on the 11th of November, which in the end backfired on Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary then, and she had to resign. But there's also been, advice by these unelected officials. The unelected special advisor on political extremism is a nasty former Labour MP called John Woodcock, who was a particular thorn in the side of Jeremy Corbyn, who turned coat and campaigned for the Tories in the 2019 election and was made a Lord as a reward for his services there. So he's now published a long document explaining that protests outside Parliament should be banned, protests outside MPs' offices should be banned, protests outside council chambers should be banned because of the intimidation of elected officials by extremists, by which he means protesters of currently Palestine solidarity protesters, but it will be used against protesters of any kind. And I think that the Starmer leadership of Labour has not opposed any of this authoritarian stuff from Rishi Sunak's government. They may well take up that same agenda. They're very close to people like John Woodcock, Lord Walney, as he's now known. And so what's really held this at bay so far is the sheer size of the Palestine movement means the Metropolitan Police and others are telling ministers, look, we can't charge in and beat people up when there's 500,000 people marching through central London. It's just going to turn into complete chaos. So actually, we can only defend our democratic rights by coming into the streets, carrying on protesting. And I don't see a Keir Starmer government as any softer on civil liberties and individual human rights and so on than the Tories. It said that it'll repeal some anti-trade union legislation, but on all of the authoritarian policing legislation that has been passed in the last 4-5 years of the Tories, the Labour Party has not opposed it. So I don't think a lot will change for us on the left on July the 5th. I think we'll be having to go out there and protest and struggle just as we have been in the recent period.
Yeah, no, I think that's an extraordinarily important point, as it were, and, struggle and protest and also, produce good people's media, as you all are doing on a regular basis there at the Morning Star to help combat in the battle of ideas. And let me just ask you this last piece before we let you go. In terms of the point you were making earlier too, relating the continent to the UK, the rise of the right. How big do you think immigration will be as an issue, in the sort of post-election period? I mean, I know that sort of both major parties and certainly Nigel Farage are very much, seem to be pushing more in the direction of the European right in terms of how they're messaging.
I think if you look at opinion polls in terms of where British people put their concerns, it's not small, but it's not at the top either. People are much more worried about the NHS, about social care, about the long-term decline in wages and so on. But because immigration is a useful scapegoat, it gets a lot more airtime than any of those issues. And there's a real nasty competition between Labour and the Tories to look tougher on immigration. people have rightly said that Sunak is chasing the really hard right, almost fascist vote with some of the stuff like the Rwanda scheme would have been unimaginable a decade ago. It tramples over international law. But also, you've had to get the Tory party, because British judges have declared Rwanda is not a safe place to deport people to. They've had to pass an act of parliament defining Rwanda as safe by definition, so that the courts aren't allowed to say Rwanda is unsafe. This is quite extraordinary. But again, Labour, they've criticised the Rwanda scheme on the grounds of its expense and its inefficiency. They've not criticised it on grounds of its breaches of human rights or anything like that. And Keir Starmer is right now embroiled in the middle of another immigration-related row because he said in an interview that people from countries like Bangladesh are not being processed. We're going to process them and send them home. And there are large Bangladeshi communities in many target Labour seats. And you've had the head of the council in Tower Hamlets in East London resign because he feels that the Bangladeshi community there has been insulted. And Labour keeps stumbling into these rows and keeps trying to compete with the Tories on whipping up anti-immigrant feeling. And then, unlike the Tories, it has a large immigrant or descendants of immigrant voter base, and so those people revolt. We saw the same thing at the beginning of the selection process when he tried to prevent Diane Abbott from standing as a Labour MP, and the backlash from the black community was so strong that Keir Starmer had to back down on that. So it's difficult to say. There's no evidence that Labour is going to be particularly more humane or push back against the right on immigration. And we saw that in front. I know I said this analogy earlier in terms of we might be in a French situation in 5 years. But what Macron has done with that centrist victory, so-called, of 2017, is he has presided over a really Islamophobic French state. He has extended political control over mosques. He has tried to ban wearing the hijab. He has taken a really institutional pro-Israeli line since the war in Gaza began. And all of that has encouraged and fueled the rise of the far right. None of it has saved the centre. It's not made Macron any more popular, but it has put wind in the sails of the likes of Le Pen. And I would worry that Keir Starmer will try and do the same thing, and it will only help the likes of Nigel Farage over the next few years.
Well, a lot to watch, a lot to continue to struggle over, and we will be watching very closely in the lead up to next week's election. The Morning Star newspaper, which everyone here should be checking out on a regular basis. You are the editor, Ben Chaco. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks very much.
Well, certainly I feel it is perhaps a good segue here, since we were just talking to the editor of a very important progressive newspaper there in the UK and really in the English language, to switch to another important press issue, media freedom issue, and certainly from the point of view of many issues around the world, interlocking with those two concerns, the freedom that was finally granted to Julian Assange after many, many years of persecution. And we are very honored to be joined here once again on the show to discuss everything coming now in the aftermath by Kevin Gostela, who is the curator of thedissenter.org and also the author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. Kevin, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, Eugene, it's good to be with you. Although I must say, I'm a little disappointed that Rania can't be here with us to chat, because I so wanted to share this moment of celebration with her.
Yes, no, I agree. I mean, she's having a great time without us for sure. I won't say where she is for the audience.
She needs the vacation. I want her to enjoy herself. I know she's one of the hardest working journalists out there, as you do too.
Indeed, and as are you. And I hope that you're feeling great. I mean, you have done so much to help illuminate everything that has happened over the years vis-a-vis this persecution of Assange in so many different ways. And I guess maybe that's my first question for you here in this moment is how big is this moment really that Julian Assange has been freed?
Oh, it's massive. This is a testament to the movement that was organized by grassroots organizations, by campaigners and the Assange defense committees all over the world, journalist unions in Europe, press freedom organizations, civil liberties and human rights organizations that raised their voice. And then all of that bubbled up. And we discussed this before. During the last year, we had the Australian government, a close ally of the US, demanding that Julian Assange be set free, that this case be brought to an end. And the former Prime Minister of Australia traveled to Washington, D.C., and lobbied directly Biden administration officials. There were meetings between Biden and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese where this was brought up consistently. The Australian High Commissioner, the most senior diplomat, was on the charter flight when Julian Assange left from London to travel to Saipan. And I'm just, I couldn't even believe that this saga would come to an end in one of the U.S. territories or colonies that we have, that it was in this courtroom in Saipan that Julian Assange was declared a free man by a judge. And I'm not entirely sure, but I believe she's an indigenous person. It was quite an incredible moment to hear her oversee these proceedings, because you just wouldn't have had this kind of attitude from a judge if this had taken place in the Eastern District of Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. She said, "I hope that peace is restored for you, Julian Assange." And she also wished him a happy birthday because he turns 53 on July 3rd. And she said, this must be the first birthday in a long time that you won't be celebrating inside of a prison or some kind of limitation, because he spent 14 years in some form of arbitrary detention, prison in Wandsworth, London, house arrest, Ecuador's London embassy for 7 years, and then 5 years in Belmarsh prison, known as Britain's Guantanamo.
I mean, really, it was an amazing saga. There were so many different elements. The CIA, I think, at one point plotting to kill him. I mean, it was such a Byzantine process. But I think it's important to remind people again, and I think it's such a great opportunity that this is the ending of the case, but why he was targeted to such a degree, because they really, truly, literally went to the ends of the earth to try to silence Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
Okay, so shameless plug, but I'm going to shameless plug here. I'm very pleased that this is now a history book, but this was written by me. I worked on this. My publisher at Censored Press, which is part of Project Censored, made it possible for me to do this book, Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange, that lays out how this all started. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go off on a little tangent. He actually did plead guilty to journalism when he was in court. I had no idea that this was going to happen, but he was asked by the judge to articulate what he did. And he said, working with my source, I published information that the U.S. government claims was classified, that I understand the U.S. government says is a violation of the Espionage Act. I don't believe it was. I think it was protected by the First Amendment, but I see that the First Amendment is in contradiction with the Espionage Act. And so basically, he said in court that he committed journalism and he's guilty of journalism. I could not believe that this was happening in these proceedings, that normally that's not what would have been said in court, but I think it also has something to do with the judge, who was very lenient about how things were handled in these proceedings. So Julian Assange was able to express his discontent about facing this charge. How this all began? This all began in 2010 and 2011, when Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, U.S. State Department cables, Guantanamo prisoner files, the collateral murder video that showed an Apache helicopter attacking two Reuters journalists in Baghdad, gunning down innocent Iraqi civilians, one of them in a van trying to rescue the wounded Reuters employees. And there were rules of engagement files as well that went along with this, so you could tell clearly that it was a war crime in Baghdad that was committed. Chelsea Manning provided the material to WikiLeaks. endured great suffering. She ended up having her sentence commuted by Barack Obama. Julian Assange was not charged initially, but again, he went through this lawfare. He went through this targeting by the US government. People who were associates of WikiLeaks were targeted regularly. And then he entered the Ecuador embassy in London in 2012. Rafael Correa granted asylum. Rafael Correa, a great anti-imperialist opponent of the United States. And then you had him in this embassy. And by 2017, with Donald Trump in office, the Justice Department was ready to go after and prosecute. Mike Pompeo at the CIA was out for vengeance because they published CIA hacking materials, and they were putting the entire embassy under total surveillance. They had sketched war plans, reportedly, according to a Yahoo News article that had more than 30 different sources from the Trump administration and U.S. Intelligence agencies. They were plotting to kidnap or rendition Julian Assange to the United States, poison him, goes so far as to assassinate him. And he ended up then, through a pressure campaign, being forced out of the embassy. He was arrested on April 11th, 2019. I believe what you're showing there on the screen. He was put into a police van by British authorities, and then he was brought to Belmarsh, where he lived in conditions 23 hours a day, 22 to 23 hours a day. He was very, very isolated. And I mean, this was harsh. And also, there's a story that a lot of people don't really know, but there was a person there, an LGBTQ person who was there who I understand he was gay and did not want to be deported back to Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil. He was a tenor. Julian Assange enjoyed listening to him sing. In fact, the UK government refused to give him protection and asylum. So he took his life. He committed suicide not far from where Julian Assange was being held. And this was a tragedy that Julian Assange had to endure. Julian Assange survived the COVID-19 pandemic in prison, deadly for so many prisoners around the world. Okay, but now he's free. And we can talk about what the precedent is for press freedom, but by and large, this is a major defeat for the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Division of the Justice Department, because I think through punishment by process, they would have been happy if Julian Assange had died in prison, and they would have been happy if they never had to deal with Julian Assange again. The last thing they ever wanted after putting so much energy and time into this was to see Julian Assange walk onto a plane and fly to freedom.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point, and I think we should talk about the precedent that's set. I mean, I know that there's some saying, well, he did plead guilty, but, I thought Stella Assange also spoke to this, saying that in many ways, one of the factors she thinks contributed to him being released is that the government was afraid to test the First Amendment defense that could, if he won, then sort of obliterate the Espionage Act's ability to intimidate journalists. So, there's, I guess, two sides to that coin. How do you see it?
Something happened. The High Court of Justice actually did something good for Julian Assange back in May. They granted an appeal hearing, and it was going to be on a narrow issue, but it was going to be about the First Amendment. And the fact that the US government was saying so clearly that because he's an Australian citizen with no ties to the United States, he has no First Amendment rights. And because the High Court of Justice believed that he should be able to make some kind of claim that he had First Amendment rights to protect him from this Espionage Act prosecution, they said, well, he's prejudiced due to his nationality. He would be, because any U.S. citizen would have much more ability to challenge, at least in my position. I'm going to take the position of Julian Assange because I could be. The journalist who is an American would have more ability to invoke the First Amendment than somebody who is a foreigner. I know that's kind of crude to say, but someone who is not from the United States would have a much more difficult time. And under extradition law, you are supposed to have equal access to any defenses that are typically available to citizens of that state. And you're not to extradite somebody if they will be prejudiced. That made the US government reconsider how aggressively they were pursuing Julian Assange. I think they were afraid of what would happen with this proceeding because his own attorney, Barry Pollock, as well as an Australian attorney, Jen Robinson, they both said that that was when the Justice Department returned to the negotiating table and was more serious about a plea deal. And they offered so many incredible things. I never would have imagined they would have offered Julian Assange, Eugene. They said that we will not prosecute you. They put this in writing, by the way, for people who are like, how are they going to enforce this? They put this in a court document that has a force that he cannot be prosecuted for anything he did prior to this plea deal. Nothing. There can be no criminal charges brought further. I know there are people who say he's now in Australia. What if they tried to indict him and go through Australia to try to extradite him to the United States? They can't, and unless he engages in more journalism after this, which he might choose to do. There are no criminal cases to be pursued. Also, there's no gag order. He can talk about anything that happened with this case. There's no prison time. There's no supervised release or probation. Australia is not imposing any restrictions on Julian Assange. And then, beyond that, the U.S. government, basically decided that they were not going to get him for publishing information. They weren't going to get him for the password cracking that they alleged with Chelsea Manning. They just got him on a conspiracy charge. And all that means, Eugene, as you know about the justice system in the U.S., is that he was coerced into accepting a plea deal so he could walk free. Do we know how many people in this country every day by the thousands accept plea deals because they just want their freedom? They're going to confess to something they never did just so they can walk out of prison.
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly, incredibly important point, and I think the work you've done on this has been incredibly important, and we'll still keep pushing forward around everything that has been revealed about the potential attacks on press freedom. But Kevin Gosselaar, curator of thedissenter.org and author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Excuse me. There. Well, since we have the criminal justice system, criminal legal system, you should say, really not that much justice involved in it. That's my editorial here. Want to segue into a really, I don't even really know how to describe it, dispiriting story, an extremely important story as the intersection of mass incarceration and the ability and the right to get an abortion, how those two things are crossing over in ways that haven't been reported that much. But thankfully, the Prison Policy Initiative has looked into this, and we want to talk more about all of this with Wanda Bertram, who's a spokesperson with the Prison Policy Initiative. Wanda, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, really happy to have you here. I mean, I felt this was a landmark bit of research that you all were able to do about probation, parole, and the ability to access abortion care. It's almost difficult to know how to start here. We're 2 years away from the Dobbs decision. Give us a sense of maybe the broad picture of how people who are on probation and parole are affected in terms of their ability to access abortion care.
Right. Well, there are nationwide, we know that there are about 800,000 women who are on probation and parole. And for those who don't know, these are different systems. Probation is an alternative to incarceration. It's an alternative type of sentence. Parole is a type of, is part of your prison sentence that you serve when you've been released early. So between those two systems, you've got about 800,000 women. We don't know, because the government data doesn't show us, the number of trans people or gender nonconforming people who are under these systems, unfortunately. We also don't have good data on the number of juveniles under juvenile probation or juvenile parole. But we did some analysis on to look at how many of these hundreds of thousands of women are going to be potentially blocked from getting abortion care out of state if they live in states that don't that have abortion bans or abortion restrictions, unless they can receive explicit permission from their supervising officer. Now, the reason that you might have to do this is because in 41 states where there are these abortion restrictions, it is a standard condition of probation, parole, or both that people on those programs cannot leave the state, even the county sometimes, without getting explicit permission. And what we found is that about 85% of women under these systems are probably going to face having to get permission from their officers if they want to leave the state to get abortion care.
Wow, I mean, there's so many different elements to this that I want to speak to, but I think maybe the first is just the idea of getting permission, because I think a lot of people maybe who don't know that much about the criminal legal system might say, like, well, of course, wouldn't they just like give them permission if they needed to have this health care? But I think that's likely not the case.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to talk about with that, right? For one thing, we know that the states with the strictest abortion laws, typically states in the Deep South, are also the states that happen to have some of the highest numbers of people who are on probation and parole, and sometimes the strictest rules on probation and parole. Right? This is not a coincidence. These are states where the governments have taken a very punitive stance towards a population that I should note is disproportionately Black. It's overwhelmingly poor. Majority of people under these systems make under $20,000 a year, right? So, and when it comes to asking permission, for one thing, who wants to ask a supervising officer's permission to get an abortion, much less disclose that they're pregnant and that they plan to do that in a state where those laws exist, right? And what people on these systems say is you can have a good officer, you can have a bad officer, right? You can have somebody who's trying their best to help you, put your life together and make your life better, or you can have someone whose sole mission as a probation or parole officer is to supervise you and to catch you in a mistake so that you are sent back to jail or prison. And if you're on probation or you're on parole, you often don't want to take that chance to find out by asking if you can go get a controversial medical procedure.
And, it feels like one aspect of that as well is that it just sort of exacerbates the public health crisis, in conjunction with the criminalization issue, because if you don't want to ask and people either decide to take something into their own hands or just say, I'm going to go to another state, that then you're sort of forced to balance between whether or not to risk your freedom or risk your health.
That's right. Yeah. And it's that's what's so concerning about this is that, people might choose not to tell their supervision officer and might go to a different state regardless. That might lead to them being criminalized for that behavior, right? Or they might choose to seek abortions within their state illegally, right? And that's also something that, because of these bans, has become much more dangerous. And I worry in particular about people who are on electronic monitors. This is a system that's becoming more and more common throughout the U.S. I believe around 200,000 people now are under electronic monitors, under probation and parole and pretrial systems alone. And people who are on EM, as we call it, have even stricter geographic boundaries. You're often wearing an ankle bracelet, or you have an app on your phone that's tracking you, that determines exactly where you are. And if you stray outside of those boundaries, or even sometimes if you don't, but the technology fails and decides you're outside of those boundaries, you can be put in prison or put in jail. And we've heard of people being violated for going to the pharmacy or going to the doctor while they're on an electronic monitor. People who are, trying to seek abortion care in another state are going to face especially uphill battles if they're on an ankle monitor.
Yeah, I mean, and it also sort of raises a subsidiary issue here as well, which is, the whole system of probation and parole, and the whole concept of electronic monitoring. And I think, obviously, especially electronic monitoring, the perception is like, these people are unsafe, and, if we track them everywhere, we'll be able to prevent them from ever doing anything. But I mean, what do we know about these systems in terms of their actual role in, at least the way they're presented in terms of their public safety efficacy, quote unquote?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it's a big part of why we're doing this research, because we'd like to bring attention to the difficulties that people face when they're on probation and parole generally. I think I should start by saying that many people say, I would rather go to prison. I'd rather take a prison term or go to jail than be on probation or parole. The reason being that these systems often set people up to fail. Nationally, people on probation have to comply with anywhere from 18 to 20 requirements per day. People on parole often face similar requirements. And these can be things, as we've discussed in previous research at our organization. I mean, these are things like having to maintain employment, having to maintain housing, having to go to meetings with your officer on a regular basis. You're forced to pay fees, and in many places, if you don't keep up with your fee payments, you can be reincarcerated for that. And the upshot of this is not to help public safety, right? This is not. These aren't programs that are helping society, especially when you consider the impact of destabilizing and putting immense pressure on nationally millions of people who are already in precarious positions financially and socially. It actually does the exact opposite of support public safety. If there are people, when we have social disorder in our communities, when we have public safety issues, when we have public health issues, we need to be responding to those with an expansion of healthcare, expansions of critical needs like housing, as opposed to putting people under this intense surveillance.
Yeah, no, I think that's an extraordinarily well put point. And one thing that, I mean, maybe seems obvious to some people, but maybe I think deserves to be discussed a little bit is, I mean, this just feels like it layers on to the very specific aspects of the criminalization of women in the criminal legal system, in the prison system. I mean, access to pregnancy care, all these different things, separation from families. I mean, this just seems to add even one more layer to, I think, obviously we talk a lot about mass incarceration, but, the experience of women in particular that I think doesn't get as much focus, in terms of the mainstream narrative about, what it really is like to be engaged with these carceral systems.
Yeah, I that's very well put, and I think that women who are I said this a second ago, but women who are going to be impacted by this double whammy of probation and parole restrictions and abortion restrictions are, I believe, some of the people who were perhaps the intended target demographic of abortion restrictions in the first place, right? People of color, people who are poor, right? There is the impact of these systems on already marginalized people really can't be overstated. And when it comes to the justice system and the way that again, as you said, the legal system treats women in particular, this is an extension of things like the war on drugs and broken windows policing, the way that those terrible policy turns in our society have brought so many more women into the probation and parole systems and thrown them in prison and jail. We've seen, for many years, the population of women in prison was growing faster than the population of men. That's not true anymore, but we still have 200,000 women who are locked up in this country on any given day. And that's a number that we could easily be reducing by doing things like decriminalizing drugs and changing the way that we police our communities.
Well, and you're speaking to it here, but I mean, I think for people who are maybe hearing this for the first time or just starting to look into this, I mean, what can we at least start to do to reduce the impact, the negative impact that policies like this are having?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that what we're trying to bring attention to with research like this is the harms of the overuse, or maybe I can just say the use of probation and parole. People should be aware in their states of the ways that these systems are impacting people, and people should not, in cases where, for instance, programs like electronic monitoring are introduced as an alternative to incarceration, in counties, and this is happening a lot, where local officials say we're going to decrease the jail population by allowing more people to go on probation or pretrial release with an electronic monitor. People should be aware of just how harmful that's going to be and push back. Lots and lots of folks who are under these systems pose absolutely no public safety threat. There's no reason for them to be on supervision at all, and it's going to ruin their life. And I'm sorry to be so doomy about it, but I really think that happens to a lot of people, and the data do in fact show that. So that's something that people can take action on in their communities is not to accept mass surveillance and in particular electronic monitoring as an acceptable alternative to mass incarceration.
Yeah, no, it's very well put, and I think an extraordinarily important point and really, really important research. So hats off to the Prison Policy Initiative. Wanda Bertram, spokesperson with PPI, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Oh, thank you so much. Take care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, crucially important thing, prisonpolicy.org, prisonpolicy.org. I highly suggest, this report's 2 years after the end of Roe v. Wade, most women on probation and parole have to ask permission to travel for abortion care. That study alone, but I do have to say, I think if you're interested in issues of mass incarceration, you have to be tuned in to what's happening, with the Prison Policy Initiative, which is putting out a number of critically important reports, excuse me, on a number of different issues. I mean, even if you just go to the front page today, you'll see important stuff about the issue of the cost of prison calls and what the rules are going to be like that from the Federal Communications Commission. And certainly anybody who has any knowledge, have been in prison yourself, this is a major issue. But they also do every single year a report called The Whole Pie that breaks down basically everything we know about who's in prison, why they're in prison, what's going on, and draws a lot of really interesting pieces. They talk about women in prison. They talk about juvenile justice as well in a major way. So definitely prisonpolicy.org, prisonpolicy.org. And I think it's critically important to check this out and also to check out a number of other critically important things that they are putting forward here, as it concerns how the system of mass incarceration is, ultimately hurting so many people on so many different fronts in so many different ways. So we really appreciate them being willing to come on and chat with us about that. One thing I just want to note here also in terms of things that are happening before we turn to our next story, something that was actually just sent to me, is that protests are ongoing in Kenya today. So remember to keep your eyes on what is happening there. Maybe as many as 20 people were killed in protests that took place on Tuesday, perhaps as many as 1 million people, some are even saying, who hit the streets of Nairobi there. And they were protesting something called the finance bill, basically a budget bill that would have raised taxes on basically everything that you could really need, on food, on cooking oil, on diapers, on menstrual products. I even saw something, I haven't confirmed this, so someone will have to fact check me here, but I even saw that they were going to raise taxes on cancer treatments and other forms of surgery or whatever it may have been. They were going to put a tax on cars, in a way that would, mainly just affect people who are, just barely making it to have a car in the first place. And obviously this is in the midst of Kenya, like everywhere else. There's a massive cost of living crisis. So of course that bill was rejected and not signed by the president. He sent it back to Parliament in order for it to be amended, perhaps could come back, might not come back. But there were hundreds of people out protesting today. Tear gas was fired. There's been reports of repression. We're going to talk more about Kenya in the future, but I just wanted to mention that in the interregnum because I did not know they were protesting today, but I wanted to just, throw that out there and also maybe, preview where we will go in a little bit here at the show. So stick with us here to the end. Let people know that we are live on the Freedom Side here on Breakthrough News. I'm Eugene Puryear. If you're just tuning in, Rania Khalek is out this week. Obviously, much to our detriment, and we are certainly sad about that, but she will be back with us in our next show. So salute to her as well. But we want to get ready here to turn to our next topic, and that is the impact of the genocide in Gaza on the U.S. military and many people inside of the U.S. military wanting out because of it. And of course, we've also seen the increase of active duty and veterans protesting. Of course, Aaron Bushnell being one of the most notable people bringing attention to this issue. But we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Mike Prysner, who is a veteran himself and also host of the Eyes Left podcast and a producer for the Empire Files. Mike, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you as always. Aaron Bushnell's sacrifice, of course, made worldwide headlines. I think many people have heard about that. But I don't think people have heard about sort of the general state of resistance in the military regarding what's happening in Gaza. Maybe they've heard this or that person has resigned. But what do we know about this? Is there a rising tide of opposition amongst service members to, the complicity of the U.S. in the genocide?
Yeah, well, I think tip of the iceberg is kind of a cliche, but it really is appropriate here. I mean, you have Aaron Bushnell, of course, at the very top of that, deservedly so, who, committed, sacrificed himself in uniform to try to wake up the American public. and members of the U.S. military. And right below Aaron on that iceberg, you have several public resignations of people like Major Harrison Mann, Larry Hebert, Juan Betancourt, both of them airmen. You have a pilot named Riley Livermore who did the same, people who are quitting the military and doing so publicly and talking to the press about it, about how it's specifically over Gaza. But then below the surface, I mean, those people we can see and we can hear from. Below the surface, as I reported in my story last week on Empire Files, we were the first to report that close to 50, maybe more by now, active duty service members have filed for conscientious objector status, which is basically quitting the military and halting your duties until that application is processed, specifically citing Gaza as their reason and their turning point for doing so. And so that's, I believe, a significant number of people, just since October 7th, who are resigning in that way. That doesn't include the number of people who have filed for conscientious objector who did not go through the GI rights hotline, people who just did it on their own. It doesn't include people who have gone AWOL because they hit a breaking point with Gaza. And we know there are a number of those people. It doesn't include people who have finagled some medical reason to get out of the military ahead of their contract because they're sick of what's happening in Gaza as well. And so, and it also doesn't include the number of service members, people in the active duty who have become part of the struggle, who have been going to protest. I know several who have been mobilizing on the buses to the national demonstrations in DC and so forth. And so, the deeper you look, the more you realize that there is clearly a growing sentiment within the U.S. military. In that article I referenced that I published, I talked to 7 active duty service members who gave me a quote for the article. A few days later, The Intercept published an article that talked to, I think, 6 different active duty service members who gave a quote for that article. And so that's coming from a very small sample size. I mean, that's just coming from the sample size of people that I personally am in touch with, and the author of the Intercept article was personally in touch with. And so you have to acknowledge, and I think the Pentagon is aware of this as well, that the sea change we're seeing in society writ large, especially among young people, in terms of consciousness around Palestine and in turn consciousness about the reality of U.S. policy, that is, of course, happening among young people in the military as well.
Well, and I'm glad you made that point about U.S. policy because, and maybe speaking specifically about conscientious objector status here, but it may be sort of a more broad question as well. I think some people might hear that and say, well, wait a second, I thought that, conscientious objector status was like, you're going to be sent to the front lines in Vietnam or whatever, and so you don't want to go fight. But the U.S. is not that directly involved, so what are they objecting to? And I thought that actually might speak to an interesting point, Mike, which is that perhaps the complicity of the U.S. with the genocide in Gaza is a lot deeper than I think maybe the average person knows.
For sure. I mean, I think it is notable that we've seen some of the most dramatic and heroic actions coming from members of the U.S. Air Force, which do have like a much more direct role in the Gaza genocide in terms of providing the munitions, like literally loading them on the planes to transport them. Of course, Aaron Bushnell's in the Air Force. Larry Hebert, who I mentioned earlier, is the one that did the active duty airmen who did the hunger strike in Washington for several weeks. Juan Betancourt as well, who was in Aaron Bushnell's unit, publicly and heroically standing up. And I talked to several other members of the Air Force who have quit over Gaza as well. And so we are seeing a surge in people who are playing, more of a direct role than the rest of the people in the military. I think with conscientious objector in general, there is a misconception, one that it's people that have their bodies are on the line and they become conscientious objectors because they don't want to be killed in a war that they don't believe in. But I think from what I know and talking to people who process a great deal of these applications, that's not really the case. I think one way to exemplify this is one of the greatest surges in conscientious objector applications and people seeking information about becoming conscientious objectors is when the story broke that the United States bombed the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan. Now, none of those people that decided to file as conscientious objectors or that prompted them to try to become conscientious objectors, none of them were people that were going to have a direct role in doing something like that, or people that were going to be sent to Afghanistan to be killed in a war that was doing things like that. It just shows that at a deeper level, people in the military, once they recognize what their government is doing and what their military is doing, they don't want to be associated in it in any way just by virtue of wearing their uniform. And, the majority of those people having no direct role, in fact, none of them having a direct role in bombing a Doctors Without Borders hospital, but there is a breaking point for everyone, and that opens your mind and to the revulsion of what U.S. policy really stands for. In terms of Conscientious Objector, I think that it's a big topic to get into, but I think it's actually very simple. Conscientious Objector is an extremely easy way for anyone in the military to get out at any time if they disagree with what U.S. foreign policy is. Technically, you can't quit over disagreeing with U.S. foreign policy specifically, but that's besides the point. The Center on Conscience and War and the GI Rights Hotline, which are free services for that aid people in becoming conscientious objectors, they have like a 99% success rate in getting people quick, honorable discharges, maintaining all benefits once people drop those applications. So if you know what you're doing, it's a really important, swift way out, maintaining all your benefits. And I think that's the reason that so many people have begun to exercise it. But of course, I would say a large number of people in the military don't know that that's an option to them. And so, it very much is. And, it's one that I think more and more people should exercise, if simply they knew about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the issue that you raised about the, folks that directly and others that we're sure you don't know, but we know that are out there who are mobilizing as a part of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and reading your article and thinking about this myself, we just lost Donald Sutherland recently, and that was on my mind because I was rewatching the FTA tour that he was involved in to reach out to active duty service members who were opposed to the Vietnam War all around Asia, by reaching them with this sort of alternative version of the patriotic, concerts and things for them. But anyway, long story short, it had me thinking about the long-term history of GI organizing as part of anti-war movements. And that's a big topic in and of itself too. But I was hoping you could just speak to that a bit, because I think it's an important aspect of the history of the movements that the Palestine Solidarity Movement is coming in the wake of.
Right. Well, Vietnam is, perhaps the most exciting example. We have, as the Pentagon said, over half the U.S. military at the time were basically mutinous. And so that's a sizable amount. I mean, from not just attending the FTA tours, which Donald Sutherland was part of, which, of course, thousands of service members attended them under threat of being punished severely if they did attend them. And they actually took the stage and spoke alongside Sutherland and Jane Fonda and others that participated in them, and denounced the war, in uniform on stage at those mass shows. But there was such widespread rebellion and acts of sabotage and things like that throughout that war. It's an incredible history that I think everyone should know about, but it's also part of a long lineage. For the entire U.S. military history and history of both war and in peacetime, there are rebellions and mutinies, even from, as you know, Eugene, the Civil War. You have soldiers mutinying, black soldiers mutinying against racism, even while they are fighting, the slaveholders at the same time. They're fighting their white officers and carrying out mutinies there. And every war and every time of peace since, we've seen this. And so we recognize that it is a phenomenon in U.S. society and is an important one, but also in other imperialist countries as well. World War I, Germany and Russia, the soldiers' rebellion was key to ending those wars. The 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal, the rise of Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. I mean, there's many examples of movements and revolutions starting and germinating from rebellion within the ranks of the military. And so I think today, as we're seeing this grow and develop around Gaza within the military, and of course, these incidents, these public resignations of, respected officers like Major Harrison Mann, who then go on mainstream news and talk about, who's also Jewish and a Middle East expert, and denouncing U.S. policy. When you see hunger strikers, people self-immolating in uniform, I mean, this creates real pressure and adds to the real crisis that Washington is in right now. And I think this story of this base of people who are not just joining protests, but deciding to quit the military and become a part of the movement as well. This shows the great potential and how, fostering this and helping this grow can really be decisive in building the amount of pressure that's necessary to, force Washington to end the genocide.
Absolutely. Well, and let me just ask you this. I mean, for those who are curious, who may even be watching this video, who themselves are, looking to pursue some of these actions, or at least know what their options are as it concerns their concern over the genocide in Gaza and the complicity of the U.S. military, where should they go? Where can they look? And do you think, just in general, we should expect to see more of this insofar as the genocide continues?
I think that as long as it continues, and becomes more horrible day by day. We're going to see more and more people reaching their breaking point within the military. But it's important that those people know where to turn to and have support and have a movement that will welcome and embrace them and help them engage in these acts of rebellion and resistance as well. If you're in the military, it's very easy to find out what to do. You just go to the GI Rights Hotline, girightshotline.org, or call the number. It's a 24/7 anonymous, highly professional, very skilled people that will help you get out of the military in whatever way you can. We also did a recent episode on the Eyes Left podcast called A Guide to Getting Out of the U.S. Military, which has everything you need to know about it. But it's much easier and quicker to just call, figure out your options. But I think the most important thing for service members, if you are exploring those options, it is, it's really critically important to engage with the movement as well. And so I think one of the things that really inspires me about Larry Hebert and Juan Betancourt, those airmen that I mentioned, is that they're not just putting in their Conscientious Objector packets quietly, they're doing it publicly and talking to the press about it in hopes that it inspires other people in the military to do the same, which I'm very confident that will do.
No, absolutely. Well, Mike, as always, we really appreciate you. Hope everyone's checking out the Eyes Left podcast and the Empire Files, where you had an exclusive article discussing this in more depth. But as always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side. Important issue. Definitely please check out the Empire Files, the exclusive dozens quitting U.S. military over Gaza in protest, empirefiles.substack.com. You can find it there. Also is reprinted at liberationnews.org. So not too hard for you to find, but I think a very important and a very crucial issue as it concerns everything that's going on vis-a-vis this ongoing genocide in Gaza, and quite frankly, how many aspects of society that it is really touching. I mean, really at every possible level, it's generating, significant opposition all across the United States. For those who are watching this here on Thursday, we have tonight the debate between President Joe Biden, former President Donald Trump, and undoubtedly Gaza, will be a part of that debate. I guess we'll just have to see how it plays out. But you've essentially got two people who are going to be on stage who are in favor of the genocide, despite the fact that we have majority of people in the country who want to see an immediate ceasefire, and the different elements and different pieces to that, in terms of arms being sent to Israel, so on and so forth. You can see that those who are opposed to the U.S. complicity in this genocide are 100% in the majority. But yet the two individuals most likely to win the presidency in the United States are actually in the minority in terms of their aggressive support for this genocide in Gaza. I mean, Donald Trump, of course, rhetorically, but quite frankly, setting the stage for a lot of this by drastically pushing forward the just already existing, making it even deeper impunity for Israel in the United States, the Abraham Accords, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which, in and of itself is slap in the face to the idea of Palestinian self-determination. I just also learned yesterday from a sort of random article I was reading that the embassy that they had before was then purchased by Miriam Adelson, the wife of Sheldon Adelson, two of the biggest donors in Republican Party politics and kind of single issue donors around the issue of support for Israel and support for Zionism, because it would make it harder for some future administration, if they so chose, to move the embassy back, because then they'd have to buy some new house. So it just shows you the depths. And again, Miriam Adelson apparently is going to spend about $100 million backing Trump this year. But, it just gives you a sense of the depths that these individuals will go to back this genocide, despite being in the complete minority. And you should also ask yourself, how can you live in a so-called democracy? That's what they tell you in civics class, where the two most likely people running for office can be dead set against what the majority of people want to see in the country. And that's somehow considered representation or representative. The same can be said to be true of Congress, which of course will have Benjamin Netanyahu there on July 24th speaking to a joint session of Congress. At least potentially, there are many calls coming out from the U.S. and Israel, by the way, for it to be rescinded. Him coming here, for the invitation to be rescinded. There are major protests, I hear, are planned around that as well later in July. But the point being, you can see that democracy is just not a factor, and I think that's why so many people are continuing to come out and protest. Why you see people even in the U.S. military quit, protest, conscientious objector status, whatever they can do, because because really there is no other way to really voice your feelings than to come out into the streets or find some other way to be heard, because the so-called two major parties are, just totally unwilling to allow any form of dissent from total and complete support for Israeli genocide. It's really really a shame. Well, we want to turn here as we close the show for our final guest, and we're very excited to be able to have this conversation because it's a very important movement that's happening in Kenya, mass protest in Kenya, as we mentioned earlier, around the finance bill. And we are very, very honored to have with us someone who, with his comrades, have been out in the streets in the course of this movement. That's Ngesa Omole, who is the national vice chairperson and the national organizing secretary of the Communist Party of Kenya. Booker, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. It's a pleasure to at least come before you today, especially when we have several against him.
Well, it's always our pleasure to have you here. I guess in the context of what's happening, maybe the first thing for those who haven't followed it as closely, what is this finance bill? What does it represent, and why are people so angry about it?
Yeah, Eugene, it's important to mention that this is the first finance bill rejected by the majority of the Kenyan people. In fact, what is now the finance rejected, but the ruling class in Kenya decided that they will impose it upon the people through what they call parliamentary approval. So it basically means that the Finance Bill 2023 and Finance Bill 2024, which was actually bringing many majority taxation, where the money, because the issue here, because the government wants to tax more from the people, but the people don't have the money. So what the Kenyan population wants is that the government should tax money, and the money is with the rich people. But the people want to enforce and impose a bill that taxes the poor and the most vulnerable in the community. For example, the basic commodities, sugar, we are talking about bread, we are talking about rice, we are talking about food. Why the Kenyan government wants to tax the most vulnerable in the society? That's the question. And even when the people stand up against this taxation, why are they so determined taxation has to be there? So these are the issues. And the second and it all was the introduction of another regime of taxes on digital content. Because remember, Eugene, the people in our country don't have jobs. So they have been on, for example, on X, on YouTube, trying to, some income out of them. Now the government wants to go to their income and tax. Last year, they taxed 50%. Now the government wants to tax 35%. And then other digital tax, you also taxed for the overall income tax. So it's just double taxation. So at the end of it, if you sum up the tax individual Kenyan person pays, other than the income tax, the value-added tax, the excise duties, the toll levy, and now what has been introduced as the housing levy, you remember that every person will be paying nearly, above 50% of their salary. But what is making the Kenyan people it? All this money, if you look at the way the government has budgeted it, most of it goes to to corruption, to expenses to sustain the offices of their spouses. This is something that annoys people very much. But also, get the foreign hands, IMF and World Bank, in drafting this bill of 2024. In fact, the Kenyan population has been clear that this is not a process that was started by the majority of the Kenyan people to represent their interest. But this finance bill was imposed upon the Kenyan people by the foreign interest, particularly IMF and World Bank, that want to pass territory that capital or profit, and actually on any privileges by the Kenyan people in regard to the benefit of the labor, the working class. It's something that is annoying the Kenyan people. And every time, for example, we have saying President William Ruto is that of the United States, imperialism, of the United States ruling class. But now we are not anymore. Now it is clear that the report that President Ruto has rolled out, including the Finance Bill 2023 and now the Finance Bill 2024, was not really a product of Kenyan, people, but a drafted, scripted CIA, IMF product that is imposed by the Kenyan people, by the Bretton Woods institution. This is what is angering the Kenyan community. We see, or even the reactionary class in Kenya now are joining hands to call out President William Samoei Ruto. The business community is not happy with him because he is favoring brokers instead of local manufacturers. So that means his friends, his families are of importing things to sell to the Kenyan people at an exorbitant price, but they do not factor in terms of local manufacturing. So the president is telling the Kenyan population, which is 45, 50 total unemployment, that the only way it can employ the Kenyan sign deals with, for example, the Canadian government, for the German government, the United States government, to export labor abroad, while there is no allocation in the F-24 on any pro-people development that will inspire our industrialization and agriculture. People are even equivocal about the issue of land now, because there is no food security in our country, but we are told the Bill Gates and Monsanto's can help us to secure food. And all solutions that is being defined of the Finance Bill 2024 are based on technology. So they are failing to address the land issue by telling us that only biotechnology and food engineering can help us through multinational. And people are rising against the imposition of unpopular, actually anti-poor policies against the Kenyan population. Find it a spark, but the Kenyan population are clear that they will want to take up their sovereignty and fight to full independence. Because at the moment, the policies that are local ruling class are only lackeys of the Western ruling class, and they're not policies that are being rolled out by Kenya. Annoying moment was last week when the people went to the street to trade, and the president was actually almost 400 young police officers to fight interested in the core group in Haiti. These are the anger that has been boiling out that led to massive protests that has taken place in the last 4 days. confirms, comrade, that there is nothing that the ruling class will give without a fight. In fact, today, if the national television and tells us that we have receded, that now the finance bill has been taken off the table. Why to take several deaths of innocent, poor people for ruling to withdraw as a bill that has been rejected by the majority of the Kenyan people? So that is why we are saying that this issue is not just about finance bill. Finance bill was the spark, but we have to push it to its final conclusion by saying that President William Ruto only represents United States imperialism. In his last less than 3 years since he took the reins of power, he has surrendered our sovereignty to the United States, particularly by even building one of the largest military bases, handing over the mother island completely to the United States military and expanding the rest of the British military base in Nairobi as well. Here in not really Nairobi, but in the west, which is in Nanyuki. So we are dealing with an imperialist puppet, and that is why we are in the street. And to tell the world, built in the streets in the last 4 days in the hands of IMF and World Bank through their local lackeys, President William Ruto.
Booker, we're having some tech issues here. We'll try to see if we can go. Yeah, I think we maybe have to drop him here. I'm waiting to hear 100%. But I think, important sort of underlining factors there that I think are critically, important is that the finance bill itself in Kenya, as Booker was bringing out, was really written or imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. So it, is not necessarily part of a Kenyan process, that the role of the international forces in manipulating the government, the impact of the taxes, which are, maybe up to 50% of the income of most working class people, and a cost of living crisis, as it were, there in Kenya. The fact that there was no chance to even stop the bill until 20 people, innocent people protesting peacefully, were shot down and murdered, working class poor people, to sort of change around the issue, and that there is a continuing ongoing struggle that's going to happen here. It looks like we might not be able to get this figured out in time. But again, that's Booker Omole from the Communist Party of Kenya. He's the national organizing secretary there, and they're putting out a number of different pieces and a number of different things through their social media as well, including some great clips of Booker from TV there in Kenya, which encapsulate some of those major points. But we'll continue to keep watching what's happening in Kenya, and we'll try to bring you more, from on the ground there as we move forward, because like I said, I think it's highly unlikely that this is just going to go away overnight here. I think that there'll continue, as there were protests today, be many people who will be out and call for President Ruto's removal. So it's going to be a very, very interesting process there. So sorry about that and some of those tech issues, but again, we'll do what we can to keep continuing to bring you various different elements there from live on the ground. That more or less brings us to the end of our show here today. Once again, Rania Khalek was out this week. Of course, we missed her quite a bit. She'll be back with us for our next show. We'll actually be off next week, by the way, but we'll be back the week after that, and we will be back as a dynamic duo, which I'm sure you are all very happy to hear, and we'll have a lot more to bring you. Big thanks to all of our guests. Big thanks to everybody who watched, you viewers who are here. Definitely a big shout out to all of our patrons who help make this show possible. And of course, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. If you want to become a patron, become an ongoing donor. It's really critically important. You can get great things like this mug. You can get special and exclusive content, like some special content from Rania Khalek's Dispatches, a seminar we do on Africa every month, and more that will be coming down the pike, hopefully very soon. So patreon.com/breakthrough news is how you get access to all of that. And most importantly, how you keep us moving forward as we continue to do whatever we can to bring you these critically important stories. Many of them are unheard. So please, whatever you can give, it's not too modest. We'd be very happy to have your support at any level. Nothing is too large, but of course, whatever you can do is very, very, very welcome. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. So once again, big thanks to everybody who joined us here on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News. I'm Eugene Perrier, and for our whole team here at Breakthrough, we will see you next time.